I'm Channing, and I'm here at the Colorado Railroad Museum in Denver. And I'm here with Jeff Taylor, the curator of this museum. And we're sitting in front of the Denver Rio Grande Western C-18 consolidation, 280, the C-18. This is number 318. And I want to just talk to Jeff a little bit about this particular locomotive and a little bit about everything else here too. First of all, tell me about yourself. How long have you been here?
This is my 6th year at the museum, but I've been steam railroading with Colorado Narrow Gauge for 16 years now in 2 different states, starting in California at Knott's Berry Farm, and then I did a stint at the Durango and Silverton as a carman in the car shop, and then got hired on here and have been here ever since 2016. Yeah.
What is your responsibility as a curator?
Well, I'm the curator of equipment and rolling stock, so I'm in charge of all of the trains, whether they operate or not. My job is to help maintain and manage volunteers to work on the equipment, operate the equipment, figure out restoration projects, find supplies, materials, and all that stuff to get projects done and completed, whether it's starting one from scratch or even, in my case, for the most part so far, finishing what others had started. That's my basic responsibilities here.
And how long have you had this beauty here?
Well, the 318 goes back to the earliest days of the museum at the original location in Alamosa when Cornelius Huck, who was one of the business partners with our founder, Bob Richardson, he actually purchased the 318 in the early 50s after the Rio Grande retired it. And it went on display with several other pieces of equipment at the South Alamosa Hotel, or the Narrow Gauge Motel, where Bob Richardson started collecting the equipment and needed a place to display it. Eventually, they kind of outgrew what room they had in Alamosa and were looking for places to move to, and Golden was the place they picked, being adjacent to Denver, so you've got a mass populace to bring out here, and all the equipment that they had moved up here, and of course they had more property, so it allowed them to grow the collection. But the 318's been around ever since.
So this was one of the early parts of this collection.
Oh yes. The neat thing is Cornelius Huck is still alive. He actually lives in Texas, and he chimes in every now and again with stuff we're doing at the museum.
Oh, wonderful.
The 318's been through a lot at the museum. It actually was put in service in the late 1970s. 1978, towards the end of the year, they actually had it in service and ran a few times, and then again in early 1979 until it developed firebox issues. Mm-hmm. And then they decided that they're going to rebuild the locomotive, and over a period of several decades, they tried to rebuild the locomotive. They did all of the running gear and did quite a bit with the boiler till it reached a point of just kind of got set aside. And the plan was still to finish the locomotive, but then priorities changed and the decision was made to just do a cosmetic restoration with the locomotive, and it came out of the shop in 2012, just cosmetically restored. And it could still run someday, but there's just no plans at the moment.
When was the last time it ran?
So 1979 would be the last time it ran. Yeah. Here at the museum, at least.
Tell me about the early history of the actual,
So the locomotive was built by Baldwin in 1896, originally for the Florence and Cripple Creek Railroad. I think it was their number 8. I can't remember for sure. It was a later batch, similar to the 315 locomotive, and these 280s were mostly used for freight service, where the 460s, like our GS-20, were used for mostly passenger service. In 1912, I think it was, the Florence and Cripple Creek had a flood that damaged a lot of track through Phantom Canyon, and ultimately it was decided the railroad was not feasible to rebuild or not profitable to rebuild, so everything went up for sale, and the Rio Grande ended up with the 280s, and the RGS ended up with 3 of the 460s. The other 3 went to other places, and 318 became the 428 on the Denver and Rio Grande initially, and then around 1922 or 24, when the railroad reorganized to become the Denver and Rio Grande Western, it became the number 318, which it stayed until the end of service. But it served all over the narrow gauge, most famously used at the end of its career on the Ouray branch, running opposite the C-19 number 340, running out of Montrose down to Ouray, and occasionally, quite often used and saw a lot of use on the RGS.
What years were these that had the most use as operation?
Well, that's an excellent question that I don't really know the answer to, but it was used quite a lot in the 1950s. Towards the end of the U-Ray branch, the crews, from what I understand, preferred the 318 over the 340 because this one supposedly rode better.
What was it really pulling in that time? Was it pulling?
It was pulling freight trains.
Freight train, not passenger cars.
It rarely was it was rarely used at that time for passenger trains. There's some famous photos of it during World War II when there was a highway issue and the Rio Grande ran a short-term passenger train from Gunnison to Montrose. And there's some famous pictures of this locomotive going through the Black Canyon with just a combine and a coach. But yeah, it did everything and all over the system. But I think most people can associate it with kind of that northwestern section of the Rio Grande around Montrose.
I have a question. So, why does it have the extended smoke box?
Several of them had early extended smoke box for a lot of the spark arresting equipment inside the smoke box sometimes takes up a lot of extra space. Some had the smoke boxes shortened while others did not. 318 and 317 both continued to the end of their service with the longer smoke boxes. The interesting part is that the 318 was combined with all of the running gear for the most part from the 317. 318 had the better boiler, 317 had the better running gear, so they combined the two. And you have a lot of components underneath the boiler that come off the 317. But for some reason it kept the longer smoke box. I don't know the exact reason, but it was just probably not worth making it shorter for any particular reason.
On the on top of the cylinders, on top of the valve chest, you got the lubricator, right?
Yeah.
What are those rings that go around it?
So the rings on top of the casting of the steam chest cover is partially designed, but it's also, an anti-slip bumpy surface essentially.
What, for people to step on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can. They're safe enough to step on when you come from the lower running board up to the upper running board where the model is sitting currently.
That explains it.
Yeah. But it's a nifty design aspect that goes back to the 1880s, 1890s, but it also has a practical purpose.
Yeah. And these were coal-fired?
Yes.
How much coal would they usually take with them?
So the tenders hold about 6 tons or 7 tons of coal, depending on the size of the tender. This particular one has a really long and crazy history of the tender itself. And the coal pocket's actually tapered. It gets narrower at the back, so it actually does hold a little less coal than other locomotives, but it also holds more water as a trade-off.
How much water does it hold?
This one's supposed to be about 3,000 gallons, maybe just a little bit more. It's also wider than most tenders. It's kind of a unique oddball tender that's been behind at least 3 locomotives that we know of.
Was it behind the 315 as well?
It was behind the 345, then it was behind the 340, and then both the 318 and 340 shared it, depending on which engine was running on the U-Ray branch, because it held more water than the normal tender that 318 had. And supposedly, again, that tender rode better, was not as bouncy or as rough down the track.
And this one has the Flying Rio Grande lettering. And I've seen the Rio Grande leaning forward and leaning backwards. Is that kind of just whatever, like when they did it?
The rule of thumb was they were supposed to lean towards the front of the locomotive, no matter which side. The fireman's side would basically look like the lettering's leaning backwards, but it was towards the front of the locomotive. Some locomotives, like 487, I think is the most famous one that people know, is they used one stencil on both sides. So one side was leaning away from the front, which made it look like it was going faster, I guess you could say. But that was probably because they just couldn't find the other stencil that day. But usually they would lean towards the front of the locomotive.
Rule of thumb, lean forward. Any like the unknown fact about this that most people don't know about?
So probably the most significant one that most people don't realize is that this locomotive never got boiler upgrades to continue operating at 160 psi. The 315, strangely enough, did. And this locomotive, along with the other C-18s, again, besides the 315, were derated to 145 psi operating pressure, which also technically affects the tractive effort. So even though it's still designated a C-18, it didn't actually make that much tractive effort. So it's not really, mechanically, it doesn't have as much power.
Just for this one.
Yeah, well, and the 317, 319, and the 320, well, and 316. The 315 was probably somewhat of an experiment. They upgraded the seams in the boilers to be a stronger design so that they could allow it to continue operating at 160 psi, which unintentionally ended up being a good thing for the locomotive in the modern era, so that it could have more power to be running today for excursions and things like that. But that's something that not a lot of people know about the 318, is that it was derated.
I see. No. So the 315, they were made at about the same time, right?
Yeah, these are a year apart.
Both by Baldwin, all for the Florence Cripple.
Yeah.
You just said before we started that the 315 is currently being serviced,
Yeah.
by the boys being serviced. Do you know when they're going to be back to operation?
It's supposed to be done this year. The Cumbres and Toltec was, of course, supposed to be running by now, and
Yeah.
the 315 was supposed to be done with its 14-year boiler inspection, but things have gotten delayed because of fire hazards and just manpower. The Durango Railroad Historical Society has contracted the Cumbres and Toltec to perform the 1472 inspection on the locomotive for them, and they're actually working with them together to actually get the work done.
And it was only just a few months ago that they had the big meet there, right? Where
Yeah,
all
the Iron Horse Roundup was in August.
Mhm.
And yeah,
half a
so
year,
it was
yeah.
August and September was basically the last few times that the 315 ran.
Yeah.
So they'll get it done later this year. It'll happen.
Yeah. If you look on on that running board is our model, the Accucraft Livesteam C-18. Well, Jeff, we thank you for
Yeah.
telling us about this, and really exciting. This is a great museum.
Thank you.
All right.